Please be advised the following content contains themes and subject matter that may be unsettling, intense, or unsuitable for some viewers. Viewer discretion is strongly advised.
You're a good debater and you're not afraid of a fight. So why have your comments off? Just out of curiosity.
Well, I've turned them on for a lot of things.
On your shorts you do.
Right. In some of my lives, I think they're on, but almost as soon as I turn them on, there's photos of my family's homes,
Okay.
what's the address, and at what point, and I just want to clarify,
please.
I don't have to take that abuse.
Agreed.
Like, I don't come to work and slap the dick out of their mouth.
Kind of why do you have a disdain for informants in your opinion?
I don't disdain them, I downright fucking hate them. That's okay. But see, this is why I can say, that Jeff's crazy, he's on medication. I have a disdain for them because no man should ever go to prison on the words of another man, number one. Number two, in 90% of the cases you look at, the informant has done more vile and disturbing crap than those that are being accused. Number three, I find it oxymoronic when a man, Joey Merlino, because everybody knows who he is, he goes in front of a judge, they can bring up everything he's ever been accused of, including murders and whatever else. Even though he's acquitted, it doesn't really matter because it's a character judgment. But yet in that same case, you can't turn that around and say, well, let's judge the rat. Judges don't allow that. So for me, it's like you're walking in, you're already behind.
I'm going to tell you something. If you two never bother me again the rest of my life, I ain't giving them that. I can't. There's good friends of mine on the say. Well, he's divorced, you have to do it tough. That's why I said to you before, you don't understand what the boss is your boss.
Welcome back to Mob Talk Radio. We are getting into the final portion of the show for this week, and we're going to be talking about Tony Accardo and Paul Ricca. And the reason why I'm covering this is because very few times when we're talking about mob history, can we mention albeit a tandem of bosses or a tandem of father and son, be it the Traficantes, who just are successful regardless. And Tony Accardo and Paul Ricca were two men who simultaneously ran the Chicago mob together. And I didn't want to do a traditional biography because to me, it's too much. It's born here, died here, this, that. I would rather get into the meat and the potatoes of who these guys are. And I think it's sort of an important lesson that you can actually have two leaders and still be successful. And so first, let's look at Anthony Tony Accardo, 1906 to 1992. Early life and background, born to Italian immigrants from Sicily, born in Chicago, grew up in the Little Italy neighborhood, a hotbed of organized crime activity, dropped out of school in his teens and took odd jobs and eventually gravitated towards street gangs. And his early foray into the Mafia started as a low-level enforcer for the Chicago mob, at which time was led, obviously, by Al Capone and Johnny Torrio first, and then later by Al Capone. And he really gains a reputation for efficiency, discretion, and tactical intelligence rather than brute force alone. He rises to the ranks during the Prohibition era by handling bootlegging, enforcement, and bookkeeping. And his rise to power by the late 1930s through the 40s, Accardo was a trusted lieutenant and then co-leader alongside Paul Ricca. He was known for his corporate-style management, delegating tasks through captains and maintaining layers of insulation from law enforcement. And he really becomes the outfit's behind-the-scenes boss, controlling strategy, national operations, and high-stakes enforcement for decades while rarely appearing publicly. Paul Ricca, 1897 to 1972, born Felice de Lucia in Italy, later emigrated to the United States. He settles in Chicago and becomes involved in local Italian-American gangs. Early exposure to criminal networks shaped his strategic and disciplined approach to organized crime. In his early foray into the mob, he works with Johnny Torrio and Al Capone in the early Chicago outfit days, initially handling loans, collections, and protection rackets. And he demonstrated exceptional skill at long-term planning, dispute resolution, and legal avoidance, earning trust from senior leadership. And his rise to power really sort of comes after he's arrested and briefly imprisoned during the 1930s, but he retained his influence. He partners with Tony Accardo in the 1940s to form a dual leadership system, Ricca as the strategist and Accardo as the operational overseer. They were focused on systemizing the outfit, turning it into a corporate-style organization with national reach, including Las Vegas casinos, labor rackets, and extortion schemes. And so what's the summary of their partnership? Well, Ricca was the brain and the strategist of the two. He was into long-term planning, political connections, and organizational structure, whereas Accardo was the executor and the operator of organized crime. He had operational control, enforcement, discipline, and longevity. And together they transformed the outfit from Capone's sort of flashy, personality-driven organization into a cohesive, long-lasting criminal enterprise, and that's why they were so good at what they did. So what was their timeline? Well, obviously we know in 1897, Felice De Lucia was born in Italy, and he immigrates to Chicago. From the 1910s to the 1920s, joins local Italian-American street gangs and builds an early criminal network. From the 1920s, he works under Johnny Torrio and Al Capone in the outfit and begins handling loans, collections, and small-scale enforcement. By the 30s, he's arrested and briefly imprisoned, maintains influence while building a reputation as a negotiator and a strategist. In the 1940s, forms dual leadership with Tony Accardo, focuses on systemizing the outfit and expanding national operations. From 1957 to 1972, was semi-retired but remains the elder statesman and second in command and the strategic brain to the outfit until his death in 1972. Tony Accardo in 1906 is born, grows up in Little Italy. He's exposed to early Italian-American gangs, joins them. By the 20s, he joins the outfit as a low-level enforcer during Prohibition and gains a reputation for efficiency, discretion, and tactical skill. By the 1930s, he handles enforcement and bookkeeping for the outfit, begins rising through the ranks due to his reliability and his intelligence. By the 1940s, he partners with Ricca in dual leadership. Accardo manages operations, enforcement, and discipline, while Ricca focuses on the strategy. From the 1950s to the 70s, controls the outfit from behind the scenes, directs national operations, Las Vegas skimming, labor rackets, and enforcement crews. In 1992, he dies a free man, having avoided the fate of many other earlier bosses due to his cautious, low-profile leadership. So the key points to their partnership was Ricca equaled a strategist and a visionary, long-term planning, political connections, and organizational structure. Accardo was the executor of that and the operator, enforcement, operational control, risk management, and survival. And together they modernized the Chicago mob, creating a hidden corporate-style criminal enterprise that lasts decades. So while Al Capone often will remain the most infamous mob figure in Chicago organized crime, the most effective leadership era came later under Anthony Accardo and Paul Ricca, acting as a long-term 1-2 punch. They controlled the Chicago outfit from the early 40s through the 70s. Their regime marked a shift from public violence to quiet violence, corporate-style criminal governance. Paul Ricca, when he gets involved in organized crime, he immediately aligned himself with Capone's organization, and he rose through bootlegging, labor racketeering, and political influence networks. And by the late Capone era, Ricca had become a trusted advisor, a liaison to national organized crime figures, and one of the few men capable of interacting with leaders across cities and states. And even before becoming official boss, he functioned as a strategic brain shaping policy rather than enforcing it. And when we look at Tony Accardo, he goes from a street soldier to the supreme authority. He in his early life, he drops out of school. He works menial jobs, flower deliveries, groceries, clerks, etc., and he transitions quickly into street crime. And Accardo joins Al Capone's network through the Circus Cafe gang and became known for extreme violence and reliability. And he earned the nickname Joe Batters, obviously, because there was an alleged killing of traitors with a baseball bat. Unlike Paul Ricca, Accardo rose through violence and loyalty. Two different men, two different sort of ideas. And this is why they function so well together. Accardo rose through violence and loyalty. He built deep relationships with soldiers and crews, and he understood enforcement, discipline, and revenue generation. And if you looked at that rise to power, the post-Capone transition, after Capone's imprisonment in 1931, Frank Nitti takes over control. Ricca operated behind the scenes sort of as a strategist, and Accardo rose as an enforcement leader, right? And then by 1943, Nitti allegedly commits suicide rather than face prison. He somehow managed to shoot himself in the back of the head 4 times. Ricca becomes the official boss, Accardo becomes the underboss, and that marked the beginning of the dual leadership structure that they had. And soon after taking power, Ricca was imprisoned for extorting Hollywood film industry. Accardo becomes the acting boss, and when Ricca gets out of prison, legal scrutiny forced him into the background, and the result of that was long-term structure where Ricca was the hidden senior authority and Accardo was the operational head. And that structure would define the outfit for the next 35 plus years. And they weren't immune to nonviolence either. Because if you look at the early era, the Capone years, you had the St. Valentine's Day Massacre. 7 members of Bugs Moran's gang were assassinated. Accardo later claimed to be involved in that. Then you had the murder of Jaime Weiss in 1926. The Northside gang leader is assassinated. Accardo was possibly involved in that. Then you have what we call the Consolidation era, and that was from the 40s through the 50s. You had the Hollywood extortion case of 43. You had Ricca getting imprisoned, and that triggered leadership restructuring. It also triggered retaliatory murders of informants in the 50s. Figures unlike Willie Beoff were killed after cooperating. And what that demonstrated was that there would be discipline under Ricca and Accardo. So think of Ricca as the guy that thought long-term, the guy that thinks, how can we do this? How can we do that? Whereas Accardo was more of the fuck him, let's kill him kind of guy. Then you look at the murder of Roger Toohey in 1959. He was killed after a legal conflict with outfit leadership. Then there were internal purges and enforcement killings, and that ensured loyalty across crews. Then you had the Giancana era. The Giancana era was the front boss strategy, right? They were taking a playbook right out of the hands of the Genovese crime family. Sam Giancana has his rise as a front boss, and Accardo and Ricca remain hidden, but they were the decision makers. So a lot of people like to say, well, Sam Giancana was the boss. He was never the boss in any capacity other than being the front boss. Everything that was decided, everything that was sort of put in motion is by Accardo and Ricca. Then you have the 75 murder of Giancana, shot in the basement at his home before testifying and believed to require approval from top leadership. So in other words, Accardo and Ricca, Giancana could never get killed without them green lighting it. And we've talked about why he's murdered. We're not going to regurgitate that here. But if you look at the late era, like say the late 70s, this is when Accardo really becomes dominant as a boss, because there's the 1978 burglary murders. After Accardo's home gets B&E'd, multiple suspects that were responsible were found strangled and killed for that action, and later testimony would confirm that he issued that order. And once they moved on from there, they continued outfit killings and just tried to keep a firm grip. And so why did they work so well together? Well, they had complementary roles, right? Ricca was a strategist. He was a diplomat of the two, whereas Accardo was the operator and the enforcer. So you have, the lesser of two evils on each side. And the reason why this worked so well is because that avoided internal rivalry, which is always the biggest fucking cancerous thing that the mob has to deal with. You have two guys, two egos, both want to be power, both want to be in the seat of power. However, these guys just worked well together, and it really kept the rank and file in control, and it really kept internal issues from boiling over, because as we know, two guys with two egos are going to go to war. These guys didn't. They also introduced a proto-corporate model. They delegated to their crews, they used front bosses, and they centralized decision-making. So it wasn't just up to one guy. It was up to the hierarchy to make decisions. The other thing is they had a low visibility doctrine. Unlike Al Capone, who loved media attention, they avoided it. They avoided flashy lifestyles for the most part, didn't buy like the $50 million house and shit like that. And they let other people take the spotlight, i.e. Sam Giancana. And that significantly reduced law enforcement pressure. Then you had the fourth thing that they did was they controlled the violence. Violence to them was strategic, not excessive, and it was used to enforce discipline, not publicity. So they didn't do things to make a public statement. They did it most often because somebody got out of line and they needed to be taught a lesson. But if you look at sort of Paul Ricca and Tony Accardo in comparison to other New York guys, it's quite interesting because if you compare them to Luciano created the commission, right? He formalized Mafia structure. And the contrast would be is like Luciano built the system and Paul Ricca and Tony Accardo perfected how to survive within that system quietly. And a lot of mob guys couldn't do that. A lot of them didn't. When you throw all the gangsters up against the wall, it's probably going to be less than 8% that were able to do this, right? Well, what about Carlo Gambino? Well, Carlo Gambino was known for secrecy and longevity. And the similarity is that they both, Ricca and Accardo, emphasized low-profile leadership. But the only difference was that Gambino ruled by himself, whereas Ricca and Accardo ruled as a duo, a team. Right? Well, what about Vito Genovese? Well, Genovese was aggressive and he was power-hungry, egocentric, greedy, and he triggered internal instability within his own crime family. But the contrast here is that Genovese centralized power openly. He didn't hide it. This is what I'm doing. Whereas Ricca and Accardo concealed the power. You knew that Vito Genovese was the boss. He let it be known. Ricca and Accardo didn't play that game. They didn't draw attention. Put Sam out there, let him take the heat, right? So the contrast is New York City has frequent power struggles. They've always, all five families have always had some sort of power struggle, right? Whereas Chicago has always had stability under those two leadership guys, Ricca and Accardo. And if you look at somebody like Joe Bonanno, just to throw shit up against the wall, Joe Bonanno attempted to dominate the commission, and that resulted in the Bonanno Wars, right? Whereas Accardo and Ricca, they kept everything stable under their leadership. And so what are some of the key differences? Well, if we look at the leadership in Chicago with Ricca and Accardo, it was dual and it was hidden. New York, singular, but very visible. As far as violence, under Ricca and Accardo, it was controlled. New York bosses, often political and internal issues. Structure, Chicago, flexible. Under Ricca and Accardo. Under New York bosses, they had a formal hierarchy. As far as stability, Chicago, under Ricca and Accardo, had high stability. Under New York, frequent upheaval, frequent issues. Public exposure, minimal for Accardo and Ricca. For New York, consistently high, right? So the conclusion to all of this is that Accardo and Ricca represent a rare model in organized crime, which was a stable cooperative leadership partnership that endured for decades. And their success came from strategic division of power, strict internal discipline, avoidance of publicity, and adaptation to law enforcement pressure. And when you compare to them to the more visible and often turbulent bosses in New York, they demonstrate that the most effective criminal leadership is not always the most famous, but the most invisible and the most disciplined. And that is the crux of why they were so successful. We've seen it a million times. We've seen it a million times. We always said the guys that lay the lowest don't need the headlines, just want to be there, get their money, and keep it moving. Those are the guys that are the most successful. That's why not everybody can be a boss, right? And so what is the timeline for all of this? Well, the 1920s, you have the early formation of the Chicago outfit under Al Capone, right? So from 1920 to 29, Al Capone begins to build the Chicago outfit. In the late 1920s, Paul Ricca rises as a strategist, like we said, and Anthony Accardo emerges as an enforcer. Then in 1929, the end of Al Capone's career basically happens when he pulls off the St. Valentine's Day Massacre. From 31 to 43, we have the transitional period after Al Capone. In 31, Capone goes to prison. The 30s, Frank Nitti becomes boss. Ricca acts as behind-the-scenes leader, and Accardo rises to capo-level authority. In 1943, there's a big turning point. Frank Nitti commits suicide by shooting himself 3 times or 4 times or 5 times in the back of the fucking head. We all know that it wasn't suicide, right? But as a result, Ricca becomes the official boss and Accardo is named the underboss. I don't think it takes rocket science to see who was behind Frank Nitti getting killed. There were a lot of reasons for it, mainly because he was acting very schizophrenic and they were afraid he would talk. There you go. And that is the beginning of their formal partnership in 1943. So from 1943 to 47, there's a crisis and there's an adaptation period. Obviously, there's a Hollywood extortion case. Ricca gets imprisoned. Accardo becomes the acting boss. And upon Ricca's release, he steps back publicly, and the real power becomes dual and hidden. From the late 1940s to the 1950s, there's what we like to call the consolidation period. The outfit expands into Las Vegas, labor unions, national rackets, and they have a system of front bosses that begins to solidify. From 57 to 66, here comes the front boss strategy with Sam Giancana. Giancana gets installed as a front boss. Ricca and Accardo remain the true decision makers behind the scenes, and there were a couple of key developments that happened during this time period. Obviously, we know the CIA and the Mafia Cuban plots with Giancana's involvement. There's increased federal scrutiny. In 1966 through 1972, there is increased pressure for a lot of different reasons. CIA, Las Vegas, Tony Spilotro, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Giancana ends up getting forced out. Internal tensions begin to rise in Chicago, and Accardo increasingly becomes dominant as Ricca gets a little bit older. 1972, Paul Ricca dies, and Accardo becomes the undisputed senior authority. In the 1970s, Accardo's final sort of foray into the organized crime, he maintained control through middlemen, and 75 Giancana's murdered before he testifies. And in 1978, retaliation killings after his home is broken into. And 1992 became the end of an era as Anthony Accardo dies, and it marks the end of the outfit's most stable leadership period in American history, right? So if these two are so good at what they did, what did the organizational structure look like? Was it different from New York? Well, the reality is it's not much different, right? Here's what they had that New York didn't have. Their biggest innovation was not leadership. It was organizational design, because they had a hidden hierarchy. A little bit different than, say, the Genoveses, who would hide the boss. They hid the entire fucking hierarchy. Very smart, very shrewd. And the true structure, right? Under the let's start with let's start with the boss. Okay, you have the boss, chairman-like role, Accardo. He had operational control. Okay, underneath him, senior advisor Paul Ricca, who was a strategic guy. Then you had the public-facing leader of the situation, which would have been Sam Giancana. Then you had captains and crew bosses control territories and rackets, soldiers, enforcers, and operators, and associates, non-initiated criminals, and business partners. So the public structure in what the law enforcement saw from their perspective was that Sam Giancana was the boss. And because that's the way they saw it, that's the way Chicago designed it. And by doing so, the real leadership is obscured from the eyes and ears of the FBI. And what that did was, and the reason why that's so important, is because it created plausible deniability, which was decades ahead of its time. Nobody else was doing that. The Genoveses did use a front boss, but they didn't use a hierarchy, a hidden hierarchy like Chicago did. So what about their operations? Well, there's two key functional divisions of the Chicago outfit. Number one, there's the revenue operations, right? That's your gambling, your bookmaking, your casino, your loan sharking, your labor racketeering, and your Las Vegas skim operations. Then you had the enforcement arm of the Chicago mob, hit teams, internal discipline, and witness intimidation. And where Accardo's influence was in the enforcement arm or the enforcement wing of the Chicago mob. That's what he was really good at. Then you have the third part of this was political and national relations, right? They had connections to unions, links to other crime families, influence over politicians, and that is what specifically Paul Ricca was good at. So between the two of them, you have murder, keeping guys in line on the street, making sure witnesses can't testify, and that's all Tony Accardo. Then you move over to Paul Ricca. He had connections to the unions, links to other crime families in different cities, influence over politicians. That is a 1-2 punch that no other duo has ever had. Okay, then you have geographic expansion. Their hub, their core is in Chicago. They hit Las Vegas, Florida, Hollywood, and et cetera. And so you have to look at this like a CEO in a hidden corporation, right? A corporate role, if you had a CEO in the corporate role of the Chicago mob, that would have been Tony Accardo, and he would have been hidden, right? If you had the chairman of the corporate, it would have been Paul Ricca. If you had the public CEO, meaning the guy that they have out front, would have been Sam Giancana. You had regional managers, captains, employees were your soldiers, contractors were your associates. And so that all leads us to the fourth and most important and integral part of this is the key innovation, the front boss system. Instead of exposing leadership, they had a visible boss absorbing law enforcement's attention. Real leaders stayed insulated, unknown, and secure. And this is one of the most important structural innovations in organized crime history. And if you look at the Italian Mafia, under Accardo and Ricca, under the model then, they were centralized but hidden, strong hierarchy, violence controlled. Now you look at it, it's more fragmented, less visible leadership, greater reliance on legitimate businesses. And that's how the Mafia has changed. The modern Mafia resembles more of a model from the Capone era than it does Accardo and Ricca. And that is what's so different about these two men. Then we look at organized crime, right? Russian. Let's look at that for a second. Well, they're decentralized, right? The bosses act more like a broker, and they have heavy involvement in global finance. And they're similar to Ricca and Accardo because they have hidden leadership and they use middlemen, right? The difference is they have a less rigid hierarchy than Chicago. Well, what about drug cartels? Well, they're highly violent. Leadership is often visible and constant power struggles. But if you contrasted that with Accardo and Ricca, cartels equal instability. The outfit was stable. That's the difference they had over cartels. Cartels resemble more of a pre-Accardo, Accardo mob chaos that's not really built for that system. But what about modern criminal enterprises like white collar and cybercrime? Well, they operate like corporations. They use layers of insulation, and leaders are rarely directly connected to their crimes. And that's a very strong similarity to Accardo and Ricca because they have compartmentalization, delegation, and risk insulation. And that model sort of foreshadowed the the modern criminal enterprise and design. So what are the key takeaways from all of that? Well, their system was so effective because they had separation of power. They had strategy versus operations. They had insulation from risk. Front bosses absorbed exposure. They had controlled violence. It was used strategically, not emotionally or personally. Corporate style organization, clear roles, delegation of authority, and scalability. And so the big picture insight here is, well, figures like Lucky Luciano created the national mafia system. Accardo and Ricca perfected how to run it long-term without collapse. And they essentially transformed organized crime from a violent street gang into a durable semi-corporate enterprise. And the genius about all of this is that the real authority, Paul Ricca and Tony Accardo, they sit above what law enforcement perceives as leadership because that structure absorbs legal risk, prevents decapitation of the leadership, and allows continuity even if the bosses are arrested or killed. They thought in the long term. So many bosses throughout history have only thought about the short term, and that's why they have short runs. These guys played it out for 30 plus years and knew what they were doing. And here are some of the most important figures who operated within the Chicago outfit system. Sam Giancana, front boss from 57 to 66, acted as the public face of the outfit, deep involvement in Cuba and CIA plots against Castro, highly visible and flamboyant. And his function in that system was he was the fucking lightning rod. He drew attention away from Ricca and Accardo and the rest of the hierarchy. Tony Spilatro, he was a Las Vegas enforcer and captain sent out to Vegas to take care of the skim. He controlled the outfit interests in Las Vegas. Like we said, skimming operations, the whole hole in the wall gang, and he was known for extreme violence. And the importance to that was he was key to the outfit's expansion into Las Vegas profits. Even if it didn't work out in the end the way they wanted to, they still made millions upon millions. And the importance here is that the key to outfit expansion into Las Vegas profits was only because Spilotro went out there. Now, could they have sent somebody else out there? 1,000%. But that's who they chose. That's what we ended up with. What about Jackie Cerrone? Well, he was a senior captain, a liaison. He was close to Tony Accardo, and he acted as an organizer and a trusted middleman, and he helped maintain internal communication across crews. Felix Aldericio, later front boss, took over after Giancana. He was more low-key, and he represented a shift towards even more secrecy. Joe Doves Ayupa, boss from the 70s to the 80s, oversaw gambling, loyalty to Accardo. His importance, maintained continuity of Accardo's system. How many times have we said Tommy Lucchese? He did just what Gagliano did, pushed it a little bit further out, but then he knew that he could only go but so far. Tony Ducks Corolla, complete opposite, went batshit hairwire crazy and started going everywhere. The system put in place, if it works, you don't fuck with it, right? Gus Alex, political fixer, specialized in bribery and judicial influence, and he was important to the outfit's political protection network. Marshall Cafano. He was an enforcer involved in murders and extortion. His importance was he maintained both discipline and fear. So if you look at everybody else that kind of gets put into a position, they're just sort of mimicking what's been put ahead of them. And so let's directly compare their system to modern groups in a more analytical way. Mexican cartels, i.e., let's talk about the Sinaloa cartel. Well, their structure, they have a boss that's highly visible. They have plaza bosses. They have armed wings. And the characteristics here are extreme violence, constant fragmentation, and leadership targeted frequently. If you look at their visibility, cartels, absolutely high. Under Accardo and Ricca, almost invisible. Stability under cartels, low. Stability under Ricca and Accardo, high. Violence, excessive under cartels. Controlled under Ricca and Accardo. Leadership survival, very short in cartels. Ricca and Accardo, decades. So the conclusion here is that cartels resemble early chaotic mob eras, not the refined Chicago model. So what about organized crime Russian-wise? Well, their structure is network-based. They have what they call vor v zakon, which are elite criminals. They have financial focus. Their characteristics are global operations, money laundering, and political influence. And if you were to compare Paul Ricca and Tony Accardo to Russian organized crime, well, the structure is loose in Russian organized crime, whereas Ricca and Accardo have a very structured hierarchy. You look at Russian organized crime, their leadership is hidden, as well as it is with Ricca and Accardo, so they have that in common. If you look at their business focus, Russian organized crime is purely financial, whereas the Italians, especially under Ricca and Accardo, had very mixed rackets. And the conclusion here is that Russian groups resemble a modern evolution of the Chicago model, but it's a lot less rigid. So what about cybercrime organizations, just to throw it way out there? Well, number one, their structure is anonymous. They have distributed teams, and they have specialists, hackers, money launderers, brokers, and etc. Characteristics, no geographic limits. And high compartmentalization. So if you were to compare them to Ricca and Accardo, the anonymity under cybercrime is extreme. It's very hard to figure out. Same thing with Ricca and Accardo. It was very high. Structure was decentralized for cybercrime and semi-centralized for Accardo and Ricca. When you look at the risk insulation, it's very high under cybercrime and very high under Ricca and Accardo. So what we can take from that was that Ricca and Accardo were early adopters of compartmentalization, which is now the standard in cybercrime. So let's look at the Italian standard, modern Italian mafia today. Well, their structure today is smaller and quieter cells, less overt violence, and business heavy. So if we look at the comparison here, the modern mafia has low visibility, just like Accardo and Ricca had them. Low visibility. Violence in the modern mafia is reduced. Under Ricca and Accardo, it was controlled. The structure is fragmented under modern mafia today and was more centralized during Paul Ricca and Tony Accardo's tenure. And the conclusion that we can make here is that the modern mafia has moved away from their model, but with less centralized authority. And so the final analytical takeaway is what Ricca and Accardo created is best understood as a hybrid system, right? Traditional mafia hierarchy, corporate management principles, and intelligence-style compartmentalization. And their lasting innovations is shadow leadership. Real bosses remain invisible. Front boss buffer. Sacrificial layer for law enforcement. Compartmentalization. Crews operate semi-independently. And violence as a policy tool, not spectacle, but enforcement. And so the big picture is that people like, Luciano, like we said it earlier, it's sort of a regurgitation, but Luciano built the very framework of the American organized crime and what it should look like. But Ricca and Accardo perfected its survivability, and their system, even going back to the 50s, looks more like a modern corporate criminal thing. Intelligence networks, global illicit enterprises, and it's just so much more than a prototypical what we see as a mob image. And so when you really take sort of the totality here, and I know I'm kind of jumping over the fence a little bit, but when you take it in its totality, in the entire history of organized crime, which is what we discuss on this show, few leaders or a few leadership partnerships have proved as durable and effective as that of Anthony Accardo and Paul Ricca. Operating the helm in the Chicago outfit for over 30 years, they transformed the outfit from a volatile Prohibition-era gang into a highly structured, low-visible criminal enterprise. Unlike their predecessors like Al Capone, their success laid in discipline, delegation, and strategic invisibility. And when we think about, Paul Ricca, listen, he came from being a street enforcer for the most part to their political operator, somebody who just understood checks and balances, who understood alliances, who understood national connections and long-term viability. Whereas Anthony Accardo really came from a grunt, sort of, what's the word I'm looking for? Grunt operations. He was the guy with a baseball bat. He was the guy with a bomb, and he was the guy with a pistol with a silencer on it. He came from the muscle and the discipline and internal loyalty sector of organized crime. And the turning point, like I said, really came in 1943 after Frank Nitti got in big trouble for the Hollywood extortion scheme and gets shot and left on the railroad tracks and et cetera. And once again, the reason why they work so well, division of labor. Ricca handled strategy, political, and national relationships. Accardo managed day-to-day operations, enforcement, and expansion. And that separation prevented internal conflict, right? They had low-profile philosophy. They avoided publicity. They used front bosses. Major decisions still required their approval no matter what. They had organizational innovation. Power was centralized. Leadership appeared decentralized, but it was actually centralized, and the outfit diversified into gambling, unions, Las Vegas, and national rackets. And then Accardo even shifted away from high-risk crimes like overt labor racketeering to reduce legal exposure. Name me one American crime family in New York that's ever done that. They tried to avoid that because they knew that was a hot-button way to get themselves fucking arrested and quick. But New York has never given that up. They've never given that up. If you look at comparison, one final comparison, their leadership style was collected versus individual. Chicago, under Ricca and Accardo, shared leadership, behind-the-scenes control. They used figurehead bosses. New York, look at Carlo Gambino or look at Lucky Luciano. They had a more formal hierarchy, clear boss identity. Public recognition within underworld. Luciano created the commission and structured national crime, but Ricca and Accardo refined how to avoid attention while still maintaining that control. Two, their visibility and law enforcement pressure. New York bosses often became high-profile targets. Think John Gotti, right? Chicago leadership deliberately stayed obscure from that difference, and the reason why is Capone falls quick. Ricca and Accardo endured even though Capone fell. And their philosophy always was, power is safer when it is unseen. Remember that. Power is safer when it's unseen, right? They had internal stability, whereas New York families frequently experienced internal wars, power struggles, egos, assassinations. Chicago under Ricca and Accardo had fewer internal issues, maintained centralized discipline, and avoided large-scale mob wars. And their economic strategy was a little bit different too. New York diversified, but heavily was tied to all of the traditional rackets that we talk about on this show. Chicago aggressively expanded geographically into Las Vegas and into Hollywood, and the outfit under Accardo even challenged New York, influence in Las Vegas. And so at the end of the day, Accardo and Ricca represent one of the most effective leadership partnerships that we've ever seen. Their success was not built on charisma or notoriety, but on discipline, structure, and strategic invisibility. And by combining Ricca's political intelligence with Accardo's operational control, they created a system that outlasted more famous regimes, avoided the pitfalls of ego-driven leadership, and turned the Chicago outfit into a national powerhouse in contrast to the more visible and often turbulent leadership of New York's five families. Ricca and Accardo demonstrated that the most powerful figures in organized crime are often the least seen. Let's see. Let me go through here. Okay. Let's see here. So Paul Ricca, one of the things that he got involved in early in those days, like I said, was bootlegging, labor racketeering, political influence networks. But by the late Capone era, Paul Ricca had become a trusted advisor, a liaison to national organized crime figures, and one of the few men capable of interacting with leaders from across different states. And even before becoming the official boss, he functioned as a strategic brain shaping policy rather than enforcing it. And that's what made Paul Ricca's. If I had to pick two key features here, the political influence alone, and just being a middleman or a liaison to other mob bosses across the United States is a big issue. It's not a big issue. It's a big deal, right? And Accardo, he does the same thing, but he does it through violence and loyalty, and he builds deep relationships really with the grunts of the family. He understood enforcement. He understood the discipline. He understood the revenue generation. He was the kind of the guy that would take care of all the nasty shit that Ricca didn't want to do, right? Let's see. We went through that. We went through the murders. We've talked about that. All right. So let's see. We've compared to Vito Genovese, Joe Bonanno, blah, 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 leadership, dual, hidden, singular. Okay. All right. I'm just going through my notes, ladies and gents. I think we're almost done for the day. And so what really, really led to the downfall, right? And I'm not going to go through all of it, but I think it makes more sense if we look at the Las Vegas skim operation. And the best example of how their system actually worked in practice. Number one, they had casino control, right? The outfit gained hidden interest in casinos like the Stardust, the Fremont, the Desert Inn through frontmen and Teamsters pension fund loans. Two, when you look at the skimming of the money, instead of reporting all revenue, the cash was removed off the books, done in counting rooms before the official tally, and no taxes were paid on the skim money. Number three would have been the role of Tony Spilatro, and his main job was to protect the skim, eliminate threats, and intimidate casino staff. And he also ran the hole-in-the-wall gang, which obviously we know is a burglary ring. Step four to the Las Vegas skim was transportation of cash, and the money was moved via couriers, hidden compartments, layered in middlemen, and the final destination was Tony Accardo and top bosses in Chicago. Step five of that was the distribution of funds, and they were divided among outfit leaders, reinvested into other rackets, and used to bribe officials. Step six of that was the law enforcement response to that, which eventually the FBI investigation would intensify. Wiretaps and informants exposed the skim. In the strawman case, federal prosecutions took place through the 70s and 80s, and the final step was the collapse of the system. And that's because problems emerged, right? Spilatro became too visible and reckless, internal tensions rose high, increased federal pressure, and the result was Spilatro gets murdered in 86, and Vegas control totally weakened. And that's ultimately, what it would have been like. So just humor me for this last part, because I've often gotten questions, what's it like being, a day in the life of a Chicago gangster? Well, if we start in the early 60s, right, the power structure would have been real authority, would have been Accardo and Ricca. The public face would have been Sam Giancana. And so what would a day-to-day be like? Well, from 6 to 9 a.m., quiet leadership, no paper trail. Accardo starts his day not in the office, but at home or a social club. No written records, no direct calls to criminals, messages relayed through middlemen. Ricca, older and more withdrawn, functions like a chairman. He advises, he approves major decisions, and he maintains national relationships. And the key detail here is they never directly touch criminal activity in a provable way. From 9 to 12 p.m., captains are in motion across Chicago. Captains manage bookmaking operations, loan shark collections, union influence, and an example flow would be street-level bookies collect bets, money moves to the soldiers, then to the captains. The capos will skim their share, and then they send it up to the chain. At noon at the office, or even without an office, meetings happens in restaurants, social clubs, hotels. Giancana may hold visible meetings, may be seen publicly, while the real decisions are made by Accardo and Ricca from 1 p.m. to 5 p.m. If we talk in casino days, casino counting rooms begin to skim cash. Money is hidden before the official accounting, and couriers prepare shipments. If you look at Hollywood and other cities where the Chicago outfit was sort of nestled in, union pressure is applied where it's needed. Payments are extracted quickly. In Florida, money laundering, real estate investments, safe haven for members from 5 to 8 p.m., money consolidation, cash flow. Local rackets head to the captains. Captains go to their central collectors. Collectors go to leadership channels. No banks, no records, all cash. In the evening, enforcement and discipline. If there's a problem, and if an informant's suspected, or if there's a theft that's detected, or if there's somebody talking out of school, the enforcement wing activates. Figures like Marshal Cafano step in. Violence is quiet, it's targeted, and it's rarely public. At night, a leadership review. Accardo and the top leadership meets. They hear summaries. They approve future moves. They resolve disputes. And a key insight to all of this is that the entire system runs like a corporation. No emails, no documents, no traceable hierarchy. So how did the FBI take them down? Well, there were several steps, and this is going to be the last part. Despite their sophistication, the system eventually begins to crack, right? So step one, the FBI begins to investigate and they begin to change their strategy from the 50s to the 60s. The early problem was the mob used secrecy and silence. There's no paper trail, no witnesses. And the FBI response to that was long-term surveillance, intelligence gathering, and wiretaps. Step two to this would be electronic surveillance, bugging social clubs and meeting spots, hidden microphones, recorded conversations, pattern tracking. And the problem is that leaders like Tony Accardo rarely speak directly to anyone about their crimes. The third step for the FBI is the financial investigation of all of this. And what they begin to do is they track unexplained wealth. Guy's got $1 million house and no fucking job. And then they begin to follow the money trail, especially from the Las Vegas skim. And that was key to all their investigations because money leaves patterns even when people don't talk, right? Step four, turning or flipping or making informants. And that was really their big breakthrough because lower level members get arrested. They're offered reduced sentences, and they turn them into witnesses. And these insiders explain the structure, the roles, the operations, the money, and everything. Step five was the Las Vegas skim exposure, and the skim became the weak point for Chicago because multiple people were involved. Interstate activity, which leads to interstate crimes, cash movement is detectable in cases like the straw man. If you look up the straw man, that really connected casinos, the skimming with Chicago. And that's what brought this all down. Step six was the game changer, and that is the RICO Act. The Racketeer Influence and Corrupt Organizations Act allowed prosecutors to charge large and entire organizations, link leaders to crimes that they didn't directly commit, and that directly attacked the Accardo-Ricca model. Step seven, targeting the middle layer. Instead of bosses, the FBI went and targeted captains, hitmen, enforcers, and financial operators. And why did they do that? Because it's easier to prove a case against them once they flipped, because they connected evidence, and that goes all the way up. Step eight would be internal weaknesses of any crime family. The system began failing due to visibility problems. Giancana became too public. Spilatro became reckless. Greed and disobedience become a major problem. Members skimmed from the skim. They broke internal discipline. Number three, generational decline. New leaders are less disciplined than those coming up the ranks. Step 9 would be high-profile prosecutions by the FBI. From the 70s to the 80s, there were multiple indictments, multiple members convicted. The skim gets exposed in Vegas, and national operations get disrupted because of it. And the end result, step 10, to all of this, is that the outfit wasn't destroyed, but they lost dominance, they lost Vegas control, they became smaller and quieter. And so what's the final synthesis to everything we've talked about today? Why did their system work for so long? Well, compartmentalization, minimal exposure, clear hierarchy, strategic violence, and why it eventually cracked was the scale-created vulnerability. Number 2, more participants equal more risk. Number 3, technology. Wiretaps caught up. Number 4, RICO bypassed insulation. And number 5, human weakness, ego and greed among the ranks. And so the big picture insight is what Anthony Accardo and Paul Ricca built was the closest thing to a perfect criminal system of its time. But even that system couldn't survive legal innovation, technological innovation and surveillance, internal human flaws. And so for the outfit and for the FBI, it's very cut clear and very simple. The FBI couldn't take down the Chicago outfit in one failed swoop. They had to slowly penetrate over decades. You know, you look in the 40s and 50s, law enforcement struggled because their leadership was hidden. Witnesses were terrified. There's no paper trail. And even after the Hollywood case and Ricca goes to jail, the core system still remains intact. And then in the 60s, there's an intelligence shift. We've talked about this before. The FBI changes their strategy under J. Edgar Hoover. The key changes were focus on long-term surveillance and build intelligence, not just arrests or convictions. And the tools that were now introduced through J. Edgar Hoover were wiretaps, informants, and financial tracking. And then they began to target the middle, not the top. They're not looking at the bosses. They're looking at the middlemen. Instead of bosses, captains, associates, couriers, etc. Those are the ones that are attacked. And that's critical because lower-level members were a lot more vulnerable to indictments and arrests. They were more likely to flip. And then finally, at the end of it all, they get the major turning point. Nick Calabrese, high-level enforcer, becomes a fucking rat. Details on murders, details on structure, details on money, details on everything. Phase 5 of that would be Vegas getting exposed. And the result of all of that's conviction of major outfit figures and exposure in national operations. Phase 6, technology and wiretaps, the 70s and 80s. They used hidden microphones, long-term bugging operations. They captured conversations, internal disputes, the names of people participating in crimes. And phase 7 of all of this, which isn't the last, breaking omerta. Historically, nobody ever talked in Chicago, right? By the 70s and 80s, everybody, long prison sentences, RICO laws, internal distrust. More people began flipping by the day. And then RICO comes along and just decimates everybody. And the RICO law was able to do what the other laws weren't. Because the RICO law directly linked bosses to crimes they didn't personally commit, and that directly targeted Tony Accardo and Paul Ricca. And like earlier eras, there was no single dramatic takedown. Instead, capos get imprisoned, operations get disrupted, revenue streams begin to weaken. And by the time Anthony Accardo dies in 92, the outfit was still there, but its power was reduced, and the system was no longer untouchable. And the outfit was so hard to destroy for 4 reasons. They had a layered structure, they had hidden leadership, they had a cash economy, and they had fear-based discipline. And the 4 reasons why it eventually toppled on top of itself: informants broke secrecy, RICO laws bypassed insulation, technology exposed communication, national operations created traceable links. And Anthony Accardo and Paul Ricca built one of the most sophisticated criminal systems in U.S. history, and it's so effective that it took 3 decades of investigation, new legal tools, and insiders turning state's evidence to finally weaken it. So the last thing I want to do is The Godfather versus the real Chicago outfit, because everybody says how The Godfather was so close to the real thing. So let's compare the system under Anthony Accardo and Paul Ricca with The Godfather. Leadership style: Vito Corleone, The Godfather. Strategic, patient, low profile. delegates violence, avoids unnecessary attention. Accardo and Ricca, the reality, almost identical in philosophy, rarely visible. Decisions were filtered through layers. And this is where The Godfather is extremely accurate in terms of the streets. Michael Corleone, he centralizes his power, right? He becomes more ruthless, right? He personally directs major decisions. And the reality comparison here is that Accardo does resemble Michael in control, but he's less emotional, less directly involved, and he's more insulated than Michael was. And the use of front bosses, well, The Godfather, the boss is publicly known. But no real decoy boss layer has been added into The Godfather. They didn't use that. However, Chicago used Sam Giancana to absorb attention. The real leaders remain hidden, and the major difference is that reality is more sophisticated. What about violence? Well, The Godfather, violence is strategic. It's symbolic. It's sometimes dramatic. But the reality is, for the Chicago outfit, violence is quiet, it's efficient, and it's invisible. No cinematic flair, just outcomes. But what about business operations? Well, The Godfather in the film, they're focused on gambling, political influence, and narcotics, which was debated in the film. For Chicago, it was much broader. They had the Las Vegas skim, the national labor rackets, the Hollywood extortion case, the multi-state operations, and the reality is more like a diversified conglomerate. What about organizational depth? Well, The Godfather is family-centered, and personal loyalty is emphasized. In Chicago, it's more institutional. Roles matter more than those relationships, and the system survives individuals. And that's closer to a corporation than actually a family. But what about emotional versus system-based power? Well, for The Godfather, decisions were influenced by family, revenge, and honor. Under Accardo and Ricca, those decisions are driven by risk, profit, and exposure. Far colder and far more analytical. You know what I mean? So what's the final verdict? Well, listen, the element here is strategy. The Godfather being accurate and Chicago being accurate in terms of having strategy. In terms of structure, The Godfather was simplified. Chicago more complex. What about violence? Well, The Godfather was dramatic, obviously, whereas Chicago was quiet. The leadership in The Godfather was very visible. In Chicago, it was hidden. The emotion ran high in The Godfather, low in Chicago. And the reality is, The Godfather is much closer to the reality than The Sopranos ever could be. But it's still romanticized. The one thing The Sopranos got right is the fucking violence and dialogue. Past all that, Past all that. I was going to go through the actual Las Vegas case, but I don't think I'm going to do that. But you know what I am going to do? I want to do a side-by-side comparison really quick, Capone and Accardo. So if we look at things, this expands beyond this is the true behavioral and operational comparison of the two men. So Al Capone, archetype. He was a gangster king, whereas, Anthony Accardo was a corporate executive. When you look at the era, Capone was during Prohibition. Accardo, post-Prohibition and modernization. Reputation of Al Capone, celebrity, criminal. Tony Accardo, invisible power. Capone thrived on recognition and fear, saw power as something he needed to display publicly, emotional and reactive at times, whereas Accardo thrived on control and survival, saw power as something to hide. Cold, calculated, long-term thinker. Capone ruled through presence. Accardo ruled through absence. Big difference. Capone had direct involvement in the rackets, personally connected to violence, centralized but personality-driven, whereas Accardo delegated everything to everybody else, rarely touched operations directly, system-driven and layered. Ricca was the same way. Capone's relationship with violence was frequent. It was public. It was intimidating. St. Valentine's Day Massacre, whereas Accardo and Ricca were rare, targeted, quiet. Retaliation killings like post-burglary murders in 78. That's about as bad as it got. You look at their relationship to law enforcement. Capone, constantly in the spotlight, constantly prosecuted aggressively, constantly imprisoned. Accardo avoided visibility, rarely directed to any directly linked to any crimes, never served major prison time. What about the business model? Well, Capone was a bootlegging empire, right? Alcohol distribution, speakeasy, protection rackets. Accardo diversified criminal enterprise, Las Vegas casinos, labor unions, loan sharking, and national rackets. What about their longevity and their outcome? Well, Capone, at best, it was at the top 5 years. Accardo, 40 plus years. What was the legal outcome? Capone goes to prison. Accardo dies free. Legacy, Capone's famous. Accardo, he's just effective. Capone made the outfit powerful. Make no mistake. But Accardo made it sustainable. So if you have your maps really quick, I'm just going to kind of breeze through some of this, okay? If we look at the Chicago outfit, crews, rackets, and territorial control, the South Side, Capone era core, later mostly absorbed. It was controlled historically by Capone, the South Side, but was later integrated under Accardo's system of primary rackets, gambling, underground casinos, bookmaking, bootlegging, speakeasies, extortion of local businesses. Key figures would have been capos under Accardo, managing crews in different neighborhoods, soldiers running day-to-day operations. Area shifted really from street-level visibility to hidden rackets under Accardo, enforcement used only when necessary. What about Elmwood Park, the West Side, controlled by Accardo and top-level associates, primary rackets, national gambling coordination, loan sharking, high-level enforcement operations, political influence. Key figures would have been Anthony Accardo, Paul Ricca, and Jackie Cerrone, who was used as a liaison and a captain. That area served as their headquarters, their meeting places, and their command hub. Operations had national scope. When we start getting over to the north side, controlled by outfit crews after Bugsy Moran's defeat, their primary rackets would have been bookmaking, loan sharking, full-scale enforcement. Key figures would have been mid-level captains, soldiers, no high-profile leadership, an area mainly of money flow but not decision-making. Downtown, the Loop, controlled by the outfit indirectly, primary rackets, financial, political, union influence, money laundering, low-profile associates and intermediaries. And that was the central hub for coordinating Vegas and the national operations. What about Elmwood Park and Cicero? Well, Capone's original headquarters, his focus at that time would have been political control and front businesses. Elmwood Park would later become the headquarters of the Chicago outfit, the leadership base, and their focus would have been on secure residence, secret meetings, and et cetera. So just really quickly, I'm going to go through. South Side, North Side would have had mid-level captains, and that would have been directly gambling. From the West Side would have been Tony Spilatro, Joe Iuppa, Jackie Cerrone, and that would have been gambling, especially specifically out in Vegas. Loan sharking would have been the West Side and the North Side. Captains and soldiers would have controlled that. The unions and labor racketeering would have been downtown or the West Side with Gus Alex, Ricca's strategic input. Hollywood film extortion would have been out in L.A., would have been Ricca overseeing that. Enforcement hits, West Side core crews, and that would have been Marshall Cafano, Tony Spilatro, hit teams. Let's see here. Let's see. And in final, just to show you some compare and contrast here, let's look at the Chicago outfit leadership territory and rackets from the 1920s to the 90s. So from the 1920s to 31, the boss was Al Capone. Key captains would have been Frank Nitti, Paul Ricca. They controlled the South Side, Cicero, and some of the North Side. Their primary rackets would have been bootlegging, gambling, speakeasies, and extortion. And Capone built the empire, centralized the South Side, flashy, violent leadership. From 31 to 34, I think that's, I don't know. You know what? 1990, so 20s to 31 to, so from 31 to 40 to the 1940s, Paul Ricca would have been your boss, Tony Accardo rising, Jackie Cerrone would have been the key captains. Their controlled areas, Elmwood Park, West Side, Chicago-wide, gambling, loan sharking, and extortion. Ricca focused on systemization. Front bosses, whereas Capone was flashy. From the 1940s through 50, whatever. Ricca and Accardo are co-leaders. Jackie Cerrone, Sam Giancana, who would become the front boss, were their key captains. Elmwood Park, West Side core, downtown, gambling, loan sharking, and extortion. Accardo handled operations. Ricca handled strategy. Giancana was the front boss from 57 to 1966. would have been Accardo, operational boss. Ricca would have been secondary to that. Sam Giancana would have been their front boss. Jackie Cerrone would have been their head captain. Elmwood Park, West Side headquarters, downtown loop, Vegas casino skim, loans, extortion. Spilatro ran Vegas. Giancana front boss. Outfit establishes national network. 66 to 1971. Accardo behind the scenes, Ricca in tow, Joe Aiuppa, Jackie Cerrone, and Gus Alex are the head captains. Elmwood Park, West Side core, Vegas skim, loans, unions, shakedowns, extortion, leadership largely invisible. Joe Aiuppa handles the Las Vegas skim from 70s through 85 or 86. Aiuppa is the national official boss. Accardo is still in power, still has the final say. Tony Spilatro becomes their main key captain out in Vegas, Elmwood Park, West Side, Vegas and Florida, Vegas skim, labor racketeering, extortion. Spilatro becomes a liability, eventually murdered in 86. RICO laws indict everybody. From 86 to 90, I want to say through the 90s, Accardo becomes the elder statesman. Jackie Cerrone and Joe Aiuppa are pretty much running things, at least visually. Various crews, Chicago city suburbs, Vegas remnants, gambling, loan sharking, and unions. Outfit weakened by the FBI and RICO leadership. And pretty much from there, keynotes and rackets and crews, gambling, south, north side in the loop, Vegas skim casinos via frontmen, Spilatro and Joe Aiuppa, Hollywood extortion via unions, loan sharking managed by captains and soldiers across the city, key funding source independent from gambling, labor unions, downtown in the loop managed by political fixtures like Gus Alex, critical for leverage over construction, entertainment, and transportation. Enforcement hit teams led by the Marshal Cafano and Tony Spilatro. Violence used sparingly and strategically. Southside, early gambling, right? Capone era core, later absorbed by the outfit. Westside, Elmwood Park, national gambling. Accardo and Ricca operations, Spilatro Vegas oversight. Downtown in the loop were the financial operations, political leverage, and union influence. North side, local bookmaking, loans, and extortion, integrated by the Moran defeat. Suburb, Cicero, political control, front bosses, and etc. Capone's early headquarters, early operations. Suburbs, Elmwood Park, leadership residence, secret meetings. And that would have been the Accardo era headquarters. Vegas, casino skimming. Spilatro, Aiuppa managed frontmen, concealed outfit involvement. All right, so this is the last thing. Timeline of leadership evolution. 1920s, Al Capone era was violent, flashy, Southside base. Ricca emergence in the 1930s moves towards invisibility and systemization. Accardo era from the 40s to the 70s, corporate-style management, front bosses, national reach. Aiuppa post-Spilatro era from the 70s to the 90s, their focus was on the Vegas skim, and RICO targeted them to weaken their operations. Post-Accardo era, 1990s onward, surviving crews reduced city control, no national dominance. And the key takeaways here are this. Capone and Accardo equals evolution from personality-driven to system-driven crime. Territory is less about physical boundaries and more about operational control. Front bosses and layers insulated true leadership from prosecution. And national reach, Vegas, Florida, Hollywood, kept the outfit profitable and flexible. And so taking all of this that we have in front of us into totality, you're never going to find a 1-2 punch like those two ever again. And while I know some people may have wanted sort of a very big biographical sort of viewpoint, I didn't want to do that because to me, showing all of you how they work together, why they work together, what were the ins and outs, all of that, why were they so proficient, now you have the answer. And I think that many of you listening to this will go back and be like, holy shit, you know, they might have been more proficient than Santos Sr. and Jr., and I think they were. But it's not very often. And that's why I said earlier when we were doing the Q&A, the acumen coming up behind them has to be good. Those who are the most successful take what's in front of them and just sprinkle a little goodness. Let's expand a little. But then there's the opposite of that, like a Tony Ducks who overexpands and just brings ultimate heat. And the question is, could they have avoided a lot of that? They could have. They could have avoided it by not leaving Sam Giancana standing out front. But then again, that's probably why they had a lot of longevity. And I think after the Vegas thing, they really should have gone really underground. And they didn't. Guys like Spilotro really made that shit worse for them. So there you go. I hope you learned something today. If you could do me a favor, reach out to us at mobtalkradioshow@gmail.com. Let us know what you thought of today's show. In the meantime, we will see everybody tonight at 7:05 on YouTube for the live. In the meantime, be good to one another. We'll see everybody tonight.